I won't spend too much time on like the practical, like this is how you do this, because frankly, you can Google all that stuff if you're really interested, and I'm happy to give some reading along the way. But so I'll just kind of give some thoughts on kind of like how you use some of those practical tools maybe in some more valuable ways rather than just the like tactics of them. So probably the biggest question I get, or any service designer gets that's hard to answer, is what is service design? And it's a relatively new concept. There's a lot of different perceptions. And honestly, a lot of times service manifests itself like in an app or a store or whatever. So people just say, oh, well, you're an app designer, or, oh, you're an architect, or whatever it might be. So it gets a little more difficult to explain. Some approaches is in the simplest form. If you're looking at two coffee shops next to each other, service design is what makes you walk into one versus the other. It can be seen as kind of this orchestration of touch points to create value across an entire system. So a mentor of mine uses an example of the opera, because I guess he's into the opera, but you've got people who design the costumes and people who write the score of the music and people who design the stage and all those things. And service design would almost be like the person who's orchestrating all that to create this amazing show. So that's another way to look at it. Sometimes it can just be seen as Post-its on a wall, kind of the design thinking pictures that you see all across the internet. And I think the important thing for me is it's not really how you define it or what your take is on the approach, but I think no matter how you approach or define it, basically you're taking intangible things and you're designing them in a way because every service has a tangible outcome. And so it's working with a lot of intangibles to create valuable, tangible outcomes. And I'll kind of, how do we make these intangible concepts like a service more tangible? These are probably things you've seen. They're kind of the main four tools, I would say, of service design. Personas, I'm sure you use a lot of journey maps, same system maps. Maybe you've come across maybe blueprints here and there. Again, I would suggest Googling any of these things if you want like more of the like practical, how do you blueprint a service? But kind of what I'll talk about is how do they show up in making design decisions? So personas, how do they affect our design? If someone were to ask you to build a bridge, you can take the simple approach of designing a bridge and you get an engineer and an architect and you build a bridge, or you could dig deeper and say, well, actually I just need to cross the river, so that opens up more possibilities. But if you were to dig into perhaps the personas of who needs to get across the river, and this is all very hypothetical, I'll give you a concrete example in a second, but if there's an old lady who needs to get across the river because that's where her doctor is, but she can't drive, a bridge does you no good. So that persona helps drive your design decisions. More tangibly, Southwest Airlines just engaged a firm, and they're testing this now actually, which was on the surface was a graphic design challenge of redesigning the signage in their terminal in Dallas. But they actually took a service design approach to all of it, and they were able to understand, if you look closely up there, you can see one of the things that says, skip the coffee, your gate is closing. What they found through research was these are the things people wanted to kind of know. And when they were looking really closely at, we've all seen those horribly designed screens at the airport, it's hard to decipher. And if I'm unsure, most people are selfish enough that they're going to go ahead and get that coffee anyway. It has a lot of impact on the employees who are trying to get the plane boarded on time, the other passengers who are sitting there boarding, and you went and got the coffee and now you're running and you're putting your bag in the overhead bin and you spill on me, all because you just wanted to know if you had time to get a cup of coffee. And so that's how that kind of using those can change how we approach just and make some fairly simple design decisions. I mean, there's nothing complex about what you see on that screen there, except there was months and months of research that went into figuring out what those short sentences should be. Getting into journey maps, kind of how can you use a customer journey to kind of make more creative design decisions. So it's not just about capturing what the journey is so people are aware of it, but if you think about if waiting in line is one of your components in a customer journey, use that to dig deep into what is waiting in line. Well, for me, and a guy who wrote his thesis on theme parks, he broke waiting in line down to two things, which is just time and anticipation. And so this particular designer, now we've all been to a theme park where when you're waiting in line, you see the ride, or it's at the scariest part of that roller coaster. So they said, well, they've got to go through this part in their journey, but forget about time. We can't reduce the time in line, but we can build anticipation, which lets people forget about the fact that they're spending an hour in line. And which is why people go to theme parks despite the fact that they wait in line for 2 hours, right? So it's not just about capturing it. It says, okay, here's a point, let's dig into it and unpack that point in the journey to see if we can do something more creative. Again, more practically, Virgin Atlantic, that journey is all about, for first class passengers, I check in, I go through security, I go to the lounge, I get on the plane, I get my meal, I go to sleep for long haul flights. They looked at a journey and they just moved the meal portion and combined it with the lounge portion. And so they feed you before you get on, which created, one, it let you get to sleep quicker if you wanted to get to sleep and not be disturbed by the meal service. It incentivized people to get to the airport earlier, which made the employees' job easier for boarding the plane. It just had less food had to be brought onto the plane, which reduced the weight of the plane, which increased fuel savings, et cetera, et cetera. So just looking at that can have impact across the system. TfL, which is Travel for London, was designing a new app to help you navigate their tube and their bus system and all the different things they had in place. And they were spending millions of dollars on it. And they had this new sexy app, and they started to walk themselves. The designers walked through the customer journeys and encountered situations like this you see, which is if I've got a phone in this scenario, it's up against my chest. There's actions you can make when you're crowded on the train like that. So how you design the user interface on that app is really important, because there's so many things I could do when I'm in that scenario. Or maybe it's more voice driven because everyone has AirPods in and I don't need to actually take out my phone or things like that. So again, it just helps drive smarter decisions. When you look at system maps, here we mapped out the flow of information at a luxury hotel and realized that anytime anyone had an idea or a concern, it went through the GM, which was really concerning, considering when we looked at it differently, all these people had pieces of information that were important for each other to know, yet it was all going through one person. So just simply by mapping out that system, you're able to understand and be able to make some smarter decisions about putting in some of those mechanisms. Again, more practical, gov.uk was over 25 different agencies and like 385 websites or something like that for all their services. And when they mapped out that system, it became really obvious that, hey, maybe if I'm looking at education and learning website, maybe I'm an international student and living in the UK is a really interesting thing that I'm going to need to access next, except they're two completely different things. So when they mapped out that system, it made a lot of sense to, can we compile all of these into one website and make that what information is surfaced when really relevant to the user. This is a really, if you're interested, a really impressive piece of service design. The website itself is not particularly attractive, but it's really useful. Lastly, the blueprint, it kind of used in a lot of different ways. You can just build awareness so you can capture what a service is. So kind of everyone involved knows what's going on. So if I'm back-end support, I know what customer facing people are doing, et cetera. Help you evaluate processes, helps you reposition touch points, and kind of this 1 + 1 = 3. I'll give you an example of that here, which is this line of visibility, which is all about what you're doing and what the customer can see. And so this is a Michelin star restaurant, and everyone's seen these, but became popular, but they were one of the first to move the kitchen into the line of visibility of the customer, which created more of an experience for the customer, held their workers to more accountability. They couldn't screw around in the kitchen because all of a sudden everybody was watching them, and it decreased the delivery time of the food from the kitchen to the person. So again, if you were to, I'm not saying these people did it, but if they were to blueprint out the restaurant experience and the service, they could play at what would happen if you moved this touch point or this system or process above or below the line of visibility. What kind of impact does that have on the user? I think my last point, I'll just give you 2 other examples, but the tools are not the outcome of service design, which I think is the common misconception, being a relatively new thing. They just help you make better micro decisions that have important impact. This last point is I view these things as kind of materials of service design because it helps me work with them better. If I have a piece of paper, I know its limitations, I know what I can do with it, and I can know whether or not it can inform my design if I'm using paper or metal to design a product. For instance, time or context or atmosphere are important things that I think I can if I view them as a physical material, I can manipulate them to change the outcome of the service, create more value.